Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. In this video, I want to give my thoughts on the AoE4 open beta stress test last weekend and where the game stands about a month out from release on October 28th. Overall, I'll start by saying I did enjoy playing it over the weekend and had fun trying the civilizations and new mechanics, though that's not to say the game doesn't have a few issues. Checking out these Steam chart numbers, people were obviously excited to participate in the stress test with around 17 to 33,000 concurrent players on Saturday and Sunday. That's more than Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition, which is shown here in blue, and notably it retained a lot of players who came back to play more on Sunday, which is a positive sign. Note that Steam Charts doesn't have the Friday numbers, and this doesn't account for people playing via Microsoft Store, so it's probably underestimating by quite a bit as well. Either way, it seems to have attracted a lot of people, and all week there's been tons of discussion and feedback on the official forums. Getting into the game, the first thing I think AoE4 succeeds at is having a quick and clean Dark Age. You start with 6 villagers instead of the usual 3, and resources generally come in faster than in previous games. There's also a new sheep scouting mechanic, which forces you to run your scout out and back from the town center a bit more often and gives you something to do in the early game. The fact you need food and gold to advance really doesn't end up complicating things as much as you might think. Early resource camps are just 50 wood, resources generate close to the town center, and villagers seem to have little or no collision, which removes the need to micro villagers on sheep and wood. Some people are obviously going to like the longer, more complex Dark Age in Age of Empires 2, and I'm not saying that one is necessarily better than the other, but given the goal was clearly to have a similar but faster start than Age of Empires 2, I think they executed it quite well. You can even create villagers while advancing, again speeding up your economy. On the flip side though, I wouldn't say the whole game is sped up. It may be too early to tell, and with most people probably spending half their time reading unit and technology descriptions, it may have been hard to notice, but many things in AoE4's mid to late game are quite slow and focused on macro compared to the rest of the franchise. Unit creation and technologies take a similar amount of time to AoE2 on paper, except in AoE2 Definitive Edition, the clock moves 70% faster than real life. That's not just because time flies when you're having fun, but in fact, it's objectively faster. For example, Wheelbarrow takes 75 in-game seconds in AoE2 to research, but in reality, you're only waiting 44 real seconds when playing at the default game speed. In AoE4, their version of Wheelbarrow takes 90 seconds of real time, meaning you're waiting twice as long for that tech to finish. As another example, in real terms, every blacksmith tech in AoE4 in fact takes 1 second longer than researching chemistry in AoE2, which, as many of you know, has a reputation for being a very slowly researched tech. It's the same thing for military units as well, where the men-at-arms has a similar training time in both games on paper, but ends up taking roughly twice as long to produce in AoE4 after accounting for the different in-game clock. The result is you have to have a large base with tons of buildings just to spend your resources. That said, the fact that you only have to destroy enemy landmarks instead of every building and unit does speed up the late game to an extent, and once you break through into someone's town, the game can end in just a couple of minutes if you focus their key buildings. Something else existing Age fans will probably like about the game is there are a lot of recognizable mechanics that make it fit within the franchise. Villagers cost 50 food, they use many of the same buildings and drop-off camps for resources, and you'll recognize many of the same sorts of units as previous games, with obviously some unique units for different civilizations. That said, it also borrows from Age of Mythology and Age of Empires 3 with landmarks and choices when aging up, as well as a fair amount of asymmetry between civilizations. In other ways though, it extends beyond previous games, especially to reduce some of the speed and accuracy required for routine tasks. One example is building farms around a mill is done automatically if you try to place them on the mill itself. The difference between archers and crossbowmen specializing in unarmored and armored units is also a distinction we haven't seen before in the franchise, and gives me a bit of a Stronghold series vibe. Also, like Stronghold, stone walls and defenses are much more intimidating to break through than in previous Age games. In my experience, you really need good siege to get through walls, which gives both sides a chance to build up armies for an epic battle. In fact, to my surprise, infantry and archers won't even attack stone walls at all, so anti-building siege like rams and trebuchets become even more important. It's a little more involved than just sending 2 petards to break through a stone wall, for example, and I think as players get more experience, they'll start using defenses even more than they did during the open beta. Another benefit I didn't see people use too much is that archers on top of walls take 1/3 of the incoming damage and have 2 more range than usual. It also appears that walls can block projectiles, at least in some cases. Moving on, the audio is generally well done, aside from the obnoxiously loud town center bell, which the devs have already said is going to be toned down. There's a lot of sounds and civilization-specific music that play throughout and add to the game's immersion. More intense music that starts when you enter a fight and units yelling during combat also creates an exciting atmosphere. And it's a great touch that your units' in-game language moves closer to their modern language each time you age up. Switching to the graphics, overall I actually think the game's fine, though it still receives quite a bit of criticism in comments I've seen. The game obviously isn't going for hyper-realism and is intended to play on even low-end computers. It would be nice to be able to turn off or even just tone down the fog, as I think it gives a somewhat washed out look, especially when fully zoomed out. Unit readability is tough to comment on this early, but the exaggerated size of the weapons does help a bit in that regard. Now, one design choice I think will throw a lot of players for a loop is how projectiles work. Age of Empires 2 fans will be used to the idea of 100% archer accuracy after thumb ring and ballistics. But Age of Empires 4 takes it a step further, with arrows being unable to miss once fired, arcing any direction they need to in order to hit their target. In fact, if you had a unit with the same speed as an arrow, I expect it would quite literally follow your unit around the map forever, as a building's range doesn't seem to matter once an arrow's fired. It's clear they're stepping away from AoE2 style micro with dodging projectiles, but I think having arrows move faster with less arcing would probably disguise the weird physics a bit more. Some players are going to argue this is a design choice, but to me this looks more like they were pressured for time and cut some corners with projectile physics to move on to other things. As it stands right now, projectiles always hitting their targets leads to a lot of unnatural arcing in midair or abrupt changes in direction. Other times, arrows just seem to fly into nowhere, presumably still doing damage to some unit or another. For me, I wouldn't call it a deal breaker, but projectile mechanics haven't quite hit the mark, and I expect it's something they'll circle back around to improve later. In terms of performance, at least for me, it was rock solid. No lag, no drops, and everything was smooth even in 3v3 and 4v4 games. There's a few graphical glitches that need to be worked out, but I wouldn't say it's a buggy game in general. It just needs a bit more polish, which is what you expect, even a month out from release. So overall, I'd say I have generally good feelings about my experience with AoE4 so far. Over the weekend, I had some epic battles and exciting games that came right down to the wire. The water map in particular was more fun than I've ever had in an Age of Empires 2 water game, as the sacred sites gave an objective besides just landing on people's islands. That said, there's obviously many things that I think need to be addressed before release. The most obvious ones are the extreme town bell sound, the lack of a global queue to keep track of units and techs, sheep being very difficult to target, the lightning bolt from the sky every time you set a gather point, and no visual feedback on waypoints. There's no shortage of great feedback on these sorts of issues on the official forums, and I'll give the benefit of the doubt that the devs are following up on those. Remember, this was always framed as a stress test for the servers, and not final gameplay. I mean, how could you forget with it bouncing around the screen the whole time? Stuff like civilization and unit balance as well has a lot of time to be refined. For me, the major issue I'm concerned about with the game at the moment is the general lack of options and customization. The biggest example that comes to mind is hotkeys. If you don't play with hotkeys, you're probably confused why I would get hung up on this, but for people that do, having a hotkey setup you're familiar and comfortable playing with is a pretty big deal. The game forces a grid hotkey setup, so you can't set individual hotkeys for specific buildings and units, and it even restricts certain keys, like the Alt key. The game also doesn't seem to recognize mouse buttons, nor are there hotkeys to select all of one type of building, like your barracks, or to even jump to individual buildings, like the market. These are basic quality of life hotkeys from previous Age games and RTS games in general, and instead they've gone with an F key system. F1, for example, highlights all of your military buildings at once, showing a small subset of the units available. In theory, that sounds convenient, but in this case, you can see it has my siege workshops included, and none of the siege units are being offered. Without that, I'd argue the F1 function is basically useless. It also forces the camera to jump every time you use one of the F keys, so trying to watch a battle while also making units, it's a constant fight to keep the camera in one place. Some people may like the grid and F key systems, and for them, I think they should leave it in. But my point is to give players coming from other games within the same franchise an option to set up their keyboard in a way they're familiar with, and the other games have done. Somewhat related, there's also a lack of control over the camera. One of the most popular requests is the option to zoom out more, which I do agree with, though I think the issue is also the unusually shallow angle of the camera, which causes everything at the bottom of the frame to be much closer and larger than what's at the top. Just like hotkeys, I think the way to make everyone happy is to let them set it up however they want. Overall though, as I said from the opening, as long as some customization options are added, I think Age of Empires 4 has a lot of potential, and will probably have healthy player numbers on launch thanks to Microsoft Game Pass. I could see it having a very healthy non-competitive side, with players who like the campaigns and epic battles against the AI. Though I could also see competitive AoE2 or other RTS players using it as a change of pace and something new to explore. It'll be interesting to see how many of the common concerns are addressed by October 28th, though I personally suspect the gameplay will be quite similar on release to what we're seeing now. Of course, with the addition of campaigns, 8 total civilizations, more maps, etc. They've already indicated through interviews that modding and a scenario editor will be added in the months following release. So it sounds like they plan to do as much as they can in the next month, release the game, and just continue to develop it from there, which, like it or not, seems like it's becoming the standard in the industry. As long as they pay attention to the feedback on the official forums though, I think they'll keep heading in the right direction. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.